What if the truth in a life or death trial depended on a child who couldn't speak, and a dog who wouldn't leave her side? Why should you care? Because one day, courage and hope may need to come from you or someone you love, and help can arrive from the most unexpected place. The courthouse was packed to the walls, every wooden bench straining under the weight of bodies and anticipation. Cameras blinked like silent insects from the gallery. Sunlight angled through grimy windows, striping the floor with golden lines that looked almost like prison bars. The air hummed with tension and whispers. This was the kind of case that could divide a whole city. 6-year-old Sophie Collins stood in the shadowed hallway outside the courtroom. Her small fist clenched tightly around the faded blue leash of a German shepherd named Shadow. Sophie's hair was tangled, her shoes too big, and her face unreadable. Her deep brown eyes flicked nervously from her mother, Rachel, to the massive doors and then to the dog at her side. Since the night everything changed, Sophie hadn't spoken a word. No one, not her teachers, not the police, not even her mom, had heard her voice. But wherever Sophie went, Shadow was there. The old dog's coat was marred by scars, his muzzle dusted with gray, but his eyes were sharp and gentle, and every muscle in his body tensed with a protective focus on the child at his side. Rachel knelt beside her daughter, brushing a wisp of hair from Sophie's face, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You don't have to be scared, baby. Shadow's right here. And so am I." She squeezed Sophie's shoulder and looked over at Grace Holloway, the K-9 officer who had trained Shadow for therapy work after his years on the force. Grace gave Rachel a reassuring nod, her own uniform crisp and steady, but her eyes were filled with quiet worry. No one really knew what would happen when Sophie was called to the stand. The prosecution was running out of options, with little hard evidence tying Marcus Reed, the man on trial, to the violent robbery and assault that had left a store owner in a coma. Inside the courtroom, Judge Linda Monroe tapped her gavel twice, her sharp features lined with exhaustion. "Court is in session," she intoned. The lawyers, the jury, and the rows of strangers all leaned in a little closer as the door opened and Sophie entered, guided by her mother and flanked by Shadow. Every head in the room swiveled to follow them. Marcus Reed, seated at the defense table, watched the child with an intensity that made even the bailiff stiffen. Reed was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes cold and flat as stone. He seemed to radiate a quiet threat that made Sophie shrink back, her knuckles white around Shadow's leash. As Rachel helped Sophie to the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Shadow moved with her, pressing his body against her leg, his tail low and still. The prosecutor, a woman named Andrea Fields, offered Sophie a gentle smile. "Hi, Sophie. My name is Andrea. This is Shadow, right?" Sophie didn't reply, only nodded, her gaze fixed somewhere between the wooden rail and Shadow's steady form. Judge Monroe cleared her throat. "Let the record show that the witness is accompanied by a certified therapy dog, approved by this court." There was a rustle of interest. Some in the gallery frowned. Others seemed to relax, as if the dog made the moment less frightening. But Marcus Reed didn't like it. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering fiercely, eyes never leaving Sophie. The defense attorney, a slick-haired man named Walton, stood up. "Your Honor, I object to the presence of the dog. It's highly prejudicial," Monroe cut him off. "The court recognizes the therapeutic role this animal plays for the witness. Objection overruled." Walton scowled, but sat. Reed's eyes narrowed, a smirk flickering on his lips as if daring the girl to look at him. Andrea began softly. "Sophie, I know it's hard. Can you tell us anything about the night at the store?" Sophie's lips trembled, but no sound came. Rachel's heart clenched. Even Andrea, with all her courtroom experience, felt the tension tightening like a rope. A murmur of impatience rippled from the defense side. Then, as Andrea tried again, "Did you see anyone there you recognize?" Reed shifted in his seat, his glare growing sharper. Sophie flinched. Shadow, sensing the change, tensed, his hackles rising just slightly. A deep, low growl rolled from his chest, soft, but unmistakable. Reed froze, startled. Even Judge Monroe sat up straighter, her eyes darting to the dog, then to the girl. For a heartbeat, everything paused. The jury glanced at each other, wondering if the dog had just detected something no one else could see. Andrea tried to recover, but the mood in the room had shifted. The silent girl with the haunted eyes. The dog that wouldn't look away from the accused. It felt as if the truth hovered just out of reach, waiting for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. Rachel squeezed Sophie's hand, and Grace, watching from the back, made a decision. She motioned to Detective Ryan Jacobs, who stood near the evidence table. Jacobs, burly and weathered from years on the force, nodded grimly. If Shadow's instincts could help Sophie, maybe they could help the investigation too. Judge Monroe raised an eyebrow. Is there a problem with the dog, officer? Grace stepped forward, her badge gleaming. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to verify the dog's reactions. Shadow's been trained to detect stress and recognize scents. If it helps the court, we can set up a controlled test, with evidence from the case. Walton rolled his eyes, but Monroe, her curiosity piqued, agreed. Proceed, but keep it quick. While the jury watched, Jacobs retrieved a sealed evidence bag, a red scarf from the crime scene. Grace led Shadow behind a screen, setting up a quick scent lineup. The moment Shadow caught the scent from the scarf, his entire body locked into focus. He barked once, a deep sound of certainty, and pawed at the evidence. Jacobs and Grace exchanged glances, their suspicions confirmed. This dog and this girl were the keys to the case. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. The jury, the lawyers, and even the judge leaned forward, watching Sophie and Shadow as if waiting for a miracle. Sophie, still silent, pressed her face into Shadow's fur, her small body shaking, but for the first time a hint of hope flickered in Rachel's eyes. Maybe the truth really could find its way out, even from the silence, and even from a child who hadn't spoken since the night that changed everything. As the first day of testimony drew to a close, no one left the courtroom unmoved. Something was happening here, something bigger than a simple trial. And in the back row, an old woman wiped a tear from her eye, whispering, "Maybe that little girl's got more courage than all of us put together." The fight for justice had begun, and with Sophie, Shadow, and the truth itself on trial, no one in that courtroom would ever be the same. The courthouse air was thick with tension. As the crowd settled after the first day, word spread quickly. There was something different about this case. It wasn't just the high stakes or the lack of evidence. It was the small, silent girl and the battered German shepherd who seemed to command the room in ways no adult could. On the morning of Sophie's second day in court, the sun hid behind clouds, leaving the courthouse in a dull gray light that matched the collective mood. Rachel woke early, her stomach tight with dread. Sophie moved quietly, slipping on her best dress, one with tiny blue flowers and a white collar, her movements careful and mechanical, as if she was performing for an invisible audience. Rachel wanted to tell her daughter she didn't have to go through with this, that no testimony was worth her peace. But the case, and the city, needed Sophie's truth. As they walked into the courthouse, Shadow trotted beside Sophie, his head high, his ears twitching at every new sound. A reporter tried to snap a photo, but Grace Holloway stepped between them, flashing her badge. "No photos of the child, please," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. Inside the courtroom, Judge Monroe reviewed her notes. The bailiff announced the start of proceedings, and the jury filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fatigue, and silent concern. At the defense table, Marcus Reed watched every move with cold calculation, tapping his fingers in an impatient rhythm. His attorney, Walton, looked over his papers, lips pursed. Detective Jacobs leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to appear calm, but glancing at Shadow more often than not. As Sophie took the stand, Rachel's heart hammered. Grace gave her a reassuring thumbs up, while Andrea Fields, the prosecutor, leaned forward, voice gentle. "Sophie, do you remember being at the store that night?" Silence. Sophie gripped Shadow's leash tighter, her gaze fixed on her shoes. Walton, the defense attorney, wasted no time. He stood abruptly, voice rising. "Your Honor, the witness is not responding. This is highly irregular," Judge Monroe cut him off. "The court has already ruled on the presence of the therapy dog. We will proceed." Walton pressed on, trying to break Sophie's composure. "Sophie, can you at least nod your head if you remember the night of the incident?" Reed's gaze hardened, his stare full of silent threat. Sophie's shoulders hunched, and for a second, Rachel thought her daughter might bolt from the witness stand. That's when Shadow moved. He leaned against Sophie's leg, his big body anchoring her, and let out a deep, low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the wood of the bench. The whole courtroom froze. Reed jerked upright in his chair, eyes wide in disbelief. Even the jury seemed to feel the energy shift. Judge Monroe's gavel cracked. "Order! Is there a problem with the animal?" Grace stood. "Your Honor, Shadow is trained to sense fear and stress. He's reacting to the witness's distress. Please allow us a moment." Monroe hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Let's take a brief recess." In the hallway, Grace crouched beside Sophie, Shadow pressing close. "You're doing great," Grace whispered. "Shadow's here. He knows when you're scared, and he'll always protect you. Just breathe." Rachel knelt on Sophie's other side. "You don't have to do anything alone," she murmured, voice breaking. "Whatever happens, we love you." Back in the courtroom, the tension had shifted. The jury eyed Reed suspiciously. Andrea Fields, seizing the moment, requested a demonstration of Shadow's capabilities. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like Officer Holloway and Detective Jacobs to run a quick, controlled scent test. It may help establish the reliability of the witness's support animal." Walton scoffed. "This is a courtroom, not a circus." Judge Monroe silenced him with a glare. "Proceed." Grace and Jacobs set up a small table behind a screen, out of direct view. Several items from the evidence room, a wallet, a set of keys, a ball cap, and the red scarf from the crime scene, were placed in a line. Shadow waited patiently until Grace gave the command. At the scarf, his behavior changed immediately. He barked once, then sat rigid, staring at the scarf, his tail stiff as a board. Jacobs looked at Grace, eyebrows raised. "That's a hit," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the jury. Grace nodded, then addressed the court. "Shadow is trained in both emotional support and scent detection. His reaction is not random. He's alerting to the item from the scene. It's the same scarf found next to the victim the night of the attack." Andrea moved quickly. "Detective Jacobs, did you previously test this scarf for fingerprints?" Jacobs shook his head. "There were no clear prints at first, but given Shadow's reaction, I'd like to re-examine the evidence." Judge Monroe agreed. The court will permit it. As the courtroom buzzed with speculation, Sophie watched, her small face inscrutable. Reed's composure began to crack. He whispered urgently to his attorney, but Walton could only shake his head, unable to stop the tide turning against them. As the day wore on, the jury's skepticism shifted. They saw not just a scared child, but a brave witness, supported by a dog whose instincts were impossible to ignore. The bailiff, usually stoic, found himself rooting for Sophie, hoping this small act of animal loyalty would be enough to break the case wide open. That afternoon, Detective Jacobs worked in the evidence room. He used a new technique, dusting the scarf again, this time in the very spot Shadow had alerted to. Minutes later, he found what he was looking for: 2 partial fingerprints, clear enough to compare to Marcus Reed's records. When the match came back, the prosecution's case transformed. They now had physical evidence linking Reed to the crime, all thanks to a therapy dog's silent signal. Meanwhile, word spread through the courthouse corridors. Lawyers, clerks, and even janitors whispered about the little girl and the loyal German shepherd. The tension in the courtroom remained high, but hope had started to blossom, fragile and insistent, among those who believed justice was finally within reach. Back on the stand, Sophie didn't speak, but for the first time she looked directly at Judge Monroe. Shadow's head rested in her lap. She reached out and stroked his ears, drawing strength from his steady presence. Outside, the sky began to clear. A single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, slanting across the courthouse steps where Rachel sat with Grace during a break. Rachel's voice trembled with relief. "He saved her," she said. "Not just in court. Every day, he's the reason she can get out of bed." Grace smiled, wiping away a tear. "Shadow's been through his own kind of darkness. Sometimes the best healers are the ones who know what it's like to be broken." As Sophie and Shadow returned to the courtroom, ready to face whatever would come next, a quiet strength radiated from the pair. Reed's lawyers sensed it, the jury felt it, and even Judge Monroe saw it. A shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the balance of justice had begun to tip in favor of the truth. Once, not so long ago, Sophie Collins was the kind of child who filled a room with laughter. Her world spun with endless questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do dogs bark? Can I have ice cream for breakfast if it's my birthday? At 6 years old, Sophie's days were filled with crayons, building blocks, and elaborate stories told to her stuffed animals. She lived with her mom, Rachel, in a modest but cheerful apartment above their favorite bakery, where the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls drifted through their windows each morning. Rachel, a single mother, often said Sophie was her sunshine. Their evenings were spent cooking simple meals together, singing along with old pop songs, and reading picture books snuggled on the worn living room couch. Sometimes, when Rachel had to work late, Sophie's grandmother would come over, bringing cookies and gentle patience. Their world wasn't perfect. Money was tight. Rachel's job as a waitress was demanding, but their bond was unbreakable, and Sophie always felt safe. All of that changed in a single night. A night that split Sophie's life into before and after. The memory would come back to Sophie in flashes, the clang of the store bell as she and Rachel stepped into Mr. Nguyen's corner market, the burst of cold air from the freezer aisle, the sound of angry shouting near the register. Sophie remembered her mother's arm wrapping tight around her, pulling her behind a stack of canned beans. She remembered a man's voice, loud, sharp, threatening. She remembered the crash of glass, the scuffle of feet, the panicked gasps, and most haunting of all, the sickening thud as Mr. Nguyen fell. There was a red scarf, a blur of movement, then the sirens howling through the night. After that night, Sophie's world shrank. She stopped speaking, at first out of fear, then out of habit. Her voice, once so loud and curious, seemed locked away behind a door only she could see. Rachel tried everything to coax her back. Favorite meals, bedtime stories, playdates with friends. Nothing worked. The bright colors of Sophie's life faded to gray. At school, she became a ghost, drifting silently through the halls, her eyes wide and watchful. Her teacher, Mrs. Lee, sent home notes of concern. "She seems withdrawn," they said. "She's not interacting. She hasn't spoken in weeks." Nights were the worst. Sophie would wake screaming, sweat-soaked and trembling, haunted by nightmares she couldn't put into words. Rachel, helpless, would sit on the edge of her bed, stroking her hair, whispering soft reassurances into the dark. Sometimes Rachel would cry after Sophie fell asleep, guilt gnawing at her. Why couldn't she fix this? Why couldn't she protect her little girl from the shadows that had stolen her laughter? Desperate, Rachel turned to experts. She met with Dr. Elena Carter, a child psychologist with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Dr. Carter tried art therapy, letting Sophie paint her feelings onto paper, but Sophie only drew thick black lines and sad, silent faces. She tried play therapy, sand trays, music. Nothing could coax Sophie's voice back. One afternoon, after a particularly tough session, Dr. Carter made a new suggestion. "Have you considered animal therapy?" she asked gently. "Sometimes, children who can't talk to people find it easier to talk to animals. There's a new program in town. A retired K-9 officer named Shadow is being trained to work with children who've experienced trauma. He's gentle, very patient, and has helped other kids start to heal." Rachel hesitated. She'd never owned a dog, and their apartment was small, but desperation outweighed doubt. She signed the forms and, 2 weeks later, brought Sophie to the community center for her first meeting with Shadow and his handler, Officer Grace Holloway. That first meeting was awkward and tense. Sophie sat stiffly on a plastic chair, her hands tucked in her lap, as Grace introduced Shadow, a large, scarred German shepherd whose amber eyes were calm and watchful. Shadow kept his distance, lying quietly on the floor, occasionally glancing over as if to say, "I'm here when you're ready." Sophie didn't speak, but she watched Shadow with cautious curiosity. After a while, Grace slid a box of crayons and paper toward her. Sophie began to draw, slowly at first. A blue sky, a stick figure girl, a big brown dog. Shadow watched every movement, his tail thumping gently on the tile. It became a ritual. Each week, Sophie and Rachel would visit Grace and Shadow. At first, Sophie only sat near Shadow, sometimes brushing her fingers along his back or listening to Grace talk about his adventures as a police dog. Grace told stories about how Shadow had helped find lost children, sniffed out danger, and once even saved her life during a late-night call gone wrong. Sophie's eyes would widen at these stories. She didn't speak, but she listened, absorbing every detail. Slowly, something shifted. Sophie began to read aloud, softly, only to Shadow, her voice so quiet Rachel had to lean in to hear it. She pointed at pictures in her favorite books, showing Shadow the colorful images. She started to trust the dog in ways she couldn't trust people. She'd lean against his side when she was afraid. She'd rest her hand on his head when the memories became too much. Shadow never flinched, never left her side, never demanded anything in return except gentle companionship. At home, Rachel noticed small changes. Sophie began to smile more. Tiny, hesitant smiles, but real. She drew pictures of dogs and sunshine and sometimes a little girl standing brave and tall. She used gestures, pointing, nodding, shaking her head to communicate her needs. It wasn't her old voice, but it was something, a fragile thread leading her back to the world. Rachel clung to these signs of hope, even as the trial loomed. She understood now that healing would not come all at once. Progress was a patchwork of tiny victories, a smile here, a whispered word there, the courage to leave the house and walk to the park. Some days, the darkness threatened to swallow them both, but on others, Rachel saw glimpses of the bright, fearless child she remembered. Most importantly, Sophie was never alone in her struggle. Shadow was there for every step, a silent guardian with a battered past of his own. He too understood fear. He too had once been hurt and uncertain. Together, girl and dog forged a bond deeper than words, a promise that, whatever darkness lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Back in the present, as Sophie sat in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers and the pressure of a city desperate for justice, she clung to Shadow's presence. To everyone else, she was just a silent child. But within her, a new strength was growing, a quiet courage, nurtured by the dog who never let her down, and the mother who refused to give up hope. And in the stillness of the courthouse, for just a moment, the weight of Sophie's pain became something lighter, as if the love between a broken girl and a rescued dog could begin, finally, to heal the world. Shadow's story, in some ways, ran parallel to Sophie's, as if their lives had been quietly drawing closer long before they ever met in that quiet therapy room. Shadow was not always a gentle, silent companion. He was once a fierce K-9 officer, a badge-wearing, rule-following partner to Grace Holloway, trusted by the police force, respected by his community. His years on the job left him marked with scars, both on his thick coat and deep inside his mind. In the early days, Grace and Shadow had been inseparable, patrolling city blocks, searching for missing children, finding hope in dangerous places. But like Sophie, Shadow's world changed in a single night. An armed robbery call had gone sideways, chaos erupted, and a gunman fired into the shadows. Grace survived, but only because Shadow threw himself between her and the threat, taking a bullet meant for his handler. Surgery saved his life, but not his career. The department retired him, and the medals and handshakes couldn't heal the new wariness in Shadow's eyes. He was left with a limp and a haunted look, withdrawn and silent, uninterested in the games and praise that once delighted him. Grace, heartbroken, refused to let him fade. She researched therapy training, enrolling Shadow in months of slow, patient retraining. He learned how to sense distress, how to sit quietly by a trembling child, how to offer comfort without asking anything in return. Grace saw glimpses of the old Shadow, the brave, steady heart inside that battered body. She always told people, sometimes the best protectors are those who've known what it is to be afraid. When Sophie and Rachel entered Shadow's life, all three were, in their own ways, lost. That first meeting, awkward and silent, was a test of trust for the child, the mother, and the dog. At first, Sophie refused to sit close to Shadow, keeping her distance, eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and fear. Shadow, trained by Grace's quiet voice and gentle hand, never forced the connection. He would lay a few feet away, his head on his paws, as Sophie colored or watched the sun crawl across the floor. Days blurred into weeks. Sophie's routine grew around her visits to the therapy room. Grace often brought a deck of feelings cards. Each one had a cartoon face and a word like happy, scared, or angry. Sophie wouldn't speak, but she began to point to cards, sometimes pushing one toward Shadow, as if the dog might understand better than anyone else. Sometimes, Shadow would nudge a card back with his nose, which made Sophie almost smile. Grace, recognizing the fragile connection, told Rachel about Shadow's own trauma. "He saved me once," she said one afternoon, as Sophie drew a picture of a big brown dog and a little girl. "He put himself in harm's way because he knew I needed help. Now he's found a new way to help. It's what keeps him going." Rachel listened, her eyes misty, realizing the weight of what Grace was saying. One day, Grace invited Sophie and Rachel to the park. The air was crisp, sunlight sparkling on dew-covered grass. It was the first time Sophie agreed to leave the safety of the therapy room with Shadow. At the park, Sophie watched other children play, her hands balled in her pockets. Shadow lay down next to her on the grass, content just to share the space. After a while, Sophie took a step closer. Then another. Finally, she sat beside Shadow, her shoulder brushing his side. Rachel, watching from a nearby bench, held her breath as Sophie reached into her bag, pulled out a worn book, and began to whisper the story to Shadow. No one else could hear the words, but Shadow's ears twitched, and his tail thumped with approval. Grace sat quietly with Rachel, both women recognizing the moment for what it was, the first small opening in the wall that trauma had built around Sophie's heart. From then on, Sophie and Shadow's bond deepened. At home, Sophie began to draw pictures of Shadow every day. She insisted on showing him her favorite cartoons, holding up the tablet for him to see. Rachel noticed that, when nightmares woke Sophie in the night, all it took was the weight of Shadow's head on her legs to soothe her back to sleep. The dog's presence brought a sense of safety that nothing else could. Grace worked with Rachel, teaching her some of the simple commands and calming signals that Shadow understood. "If Sophie ever seems overwhelmed," Grace said, "have Shadow sit with her and just breathe. He'll match his breathing to hers. It's a trick from his therapy training. Helps bring her back from panic." Rachel was grateful, but she also felt pangs of worry. Would Sophie ever speak to people again? Or would she only find comfort in Shadow's quiet company? Dr. Carter, the child psychologist, reassured her, "Healing isn't about returning to who she was before. It's about moving forward, even if the path is different than you expected. Shadow isn't a crutch. He's a bridge." One afternoon, as the golden light slanted through the window, Rachel overheard Sophie in her room. At first, she thought Sophie was just humming, but as she pressed her ear closer, she realized her daughter was whispering words, telling Shadow all about her dreams, her fears, her favorite colors, and the monsters in her nightmares. Rachel wept quietly in the hallway, relief and hope mixing in her chest. At the therapy center, Grace began to notice changes too. Sophie became braver in small, subtle ways. She would help brush Shadow, giggling when he tried to lick her hand. She started to make choices, which treat Shadow would get, which book she'd read to him. She began to interact, in her own way, with other therapy dogs and children, nodding or smiling when someone offered her a toy or a crayon. As the trial date approached, Sophie's anxiety returned, but this time she faced it with Shadow's steady support. Rachel, watching her daughter, realized that the girl who had once been shattered by trauma was, little by little, rebuilding herself, with Shadow as her guide. There was one moment that stood out above all the others. A rainy afternoon when Sophie, curled up beside Shadow, reached for Rachel's hand and held it tightly. She didn't speak, but in that gesture Rachel felt the strength of all they had overcome together. It was proof that, while the road ahead would not be easy, Sophie was no longer facing it alone. In their own ways, both Sophie and Shadow had found second chances. Their wounds hadn't vanished, but together they had learned to live with them. And as the day of Sophie's testimony drew nearer, everyone who had witnessed their journey, Rachel, Grace, Dr. Carter, and even the skeptical detectives, began to hope that maybe, just maybe, the bond between a silent girl and a once broken dog would be enough to bring the truth into the light. Inside the oak-paneled courtroom, the atmosphere had grown tense and unpredictable. The case against Marcus Reed was hanging by a thread, every new development watched by a public hungry for resolution. Judge Monroe presided with the weight of the city on her shoulders, aware that her every decision might one day be analyzed in law school textbooks and local newspaper columns. Sophie, still mute, came each day with Shadow by her side, a living contradiction to the cold formality of the justice system. After the controlled scent test, word spread quickly through the courthouse. The therapy dog wasn't just there for comfort. He was a link to the truth. It put the defense on edge. Walton, Reed's lawyer, doubled down, his strategy shifting from cool indifference to open hostility toward the dog and anyone defending Shadow's presence. On a rainy morning, the defense team filed a formal motion to have Shadow removed from the proceedings. "Your Honor," Walton declared, his voice sharp with confidence, "this animal is unduly prejudicial. His reactions could sway the jury with no basis in law or fact. We ask for immediate removal." Andrea Fields, the prosecutor, rose with a calm steadiness. "Your Honor, Shadow's presence is documented as therapeutic necessity. He is not simply a pet. He is part of Sophie's ability to function as a witness. Removing him would be akin to taking away her wheelchair if she could not walk. Furthermore, his recent reactions to case evidence have been validated by both law enforcement and a trained handler." The room buzzed with murmurs. Judge Monroe tapped her gavel for silence. She looked at Sophie, then at the loyal dog sitting quietly at her feet, alert and attentive. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice resolute. "The court finds that Shadow's therapeutic necessity outweighs the risk of prejudice. The motion to remove the dog is denied. Let it be clear, this court is committed to ensuring every witness has the support they need to seek justice." Rachel's hand, resting on Sophie's shoulder, relaxed in relief. Sophie's eyes flicked toward the judge, and for the briefest moment, hope glimmered across her face. But the defense would not give up so easily. They shifted tactics. Walton requested that Sophie be presented with the red scarf from the crime scene, claiming it would gently prompt her memory. Judge Monroe, after consulting both legal teams, agreed, but ordered that the process be strictly monitored and that Grace, as Shadow's handler, be present to observe. During the session, the courtroom's tension felt almost electric. Detective Jacobs placed the scarf in a sterile plastic tray, setting it in front of Sophie. Reed, who until now had appeared cool and impassive, suddenly leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if trying to catch Sophie's gaze and unsettle her. The moment his hand reached toward the scarf, just a fraction, as if in reflex, Shadow reacted with instinctual ferocity. He positioned himself between Reed and the evidence, his hackles rising, lips curling in a protective snarl that echoed through the silent room. "Order!" Judge Monroe commanded, as the bailiff stepped closer. "Mr. Reed, do not approach the evidence." Shadow held his ground until Grace knelt beside him and gave a gentle command. The tension dissipated as the dog sat back, but his message was unmistakable. No harm would come to Sophie, not on his watch. That outburst gave Andrea an idea. In a hushed conversation with Jacobs, she asked if they could re-examine the scarf, especially the area that had provoked Shadow's reaction. Jacobs agreed. In the lab that evening, under new lighting and with advanced powder, he discovered something the original investigation had missed. A partial fingerprint in a section of the scarf, faint but clear enough for analysis. Within 24 hours, Jacobs rushed into the courthouse holding the forensic report. "Andrea, you need to see this," he whispered. The partial print matched Marcus Reed's right index finger. There was no plausible explanation for how his print could have ended up there unless he'd been present during the attack. The next day, Andrea called Detective Jacobs to the stand. In front of the jury, she detailed the process by which the new evidence had come to light, crediting Shadow's reaction as the catalyst for the renewed examination. When the matching fingerprint was revealed, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Monroe seemed moved, leaning forward to scrutinize the report. Walton tried to cast doubt, suggesting the print could have been transferred in any number of innocent ways. But the momentum had shifted. The prosecution now had what it had desperately lacked: a physical link between Reed and the scene of the crime. Meanwhile, the presence of Shadow continued to affect the proceedings in unexpected ways. Jurors watched his every movement. Some scribbled notes each time the dog changed posture or tensed up as testimony was given. One particularly tense afternoon, Reed's alibi witness, a friend with a shaky reputation, took the stand. When he began to recount his story, Shadow, lying near Sophie, sat up abruptly, eyes locked on the man. The jury noticed. Whether or not Shadow's instincts could be trusted as evidence, he was influencing the perceptions of everyone in the room. Back in the hallway, after a long day, Rachel found herself surrounded by reporters. She kept her head down, but one young journalist called out, "Do you think the dog can really help win the case?" Rachel thought about everything she had witnessed. The way Sophie drew strength from Shadow. The way evidence was found because of a dog's unwavering attention. She finally answered, "I think Shadow helps us all see the truth, sometimes better than words ever could." That night, in their temporary apartment, Sophie surprised her mother. As she sat cross-legged on her bed, Shadow's head in her lap, Sophie drew a picture. It was of the courtroom, with herself, her mom, Grace, Detective Jacobs, Judge Monroe, and Shadow standing bravely in front of them all. She handed it to Rachel, who hugged her tightly. No words passed between them, but something powerful had been communicated nonetheless. Over the next few days, the trial gained national attention. News crews waited outside the courthouse. Commentators debated the use of therapy dogs in legal settings. Social media erupted with hashtags about the brave girl and her dog. But inside the courtroom, the real work continued. Witnesses were called, evidence was re-examined, and the bond between Sophie and Shadow only grew stronger under pressure. In the final moments of that week's testimony, Andrea Fields addressed the court. Sometimes justice is found not in loud arguments or dramatic speeches, but in the quiet, steady courage of those who refuse to give up. Today, it's clear. Without Shadow's presence, the truth might have stayed hidden forever. And as the court recessed for the weekend, the city held its breath. The fate of Marcus Reed, and perhaps something bigger, a lesson about hope and healing, now rested on the next steps of a little girl and her loyal, extraordinary dog. By the time Friday afternoon arrived, the world outside the courthouse had transformed. What began as a local story was now headline news. National broadcasts replayed footage of Sophie walking hand in hand with Shadow, while radio commentators speculated about the fate of Marcus Reed. Despite the growing sense of public hope, a dark undercurrent ran just beneath the surface. With the case turning against Reed, not everyone wanted the truth to win out. Rachel could sense it. The eyes that lingered a moment too long outside their apartment building, the unfamiliar van that seemed to idle on their street a little too often. Even Sophie, who was usually focused inward, flinched at sudden noises and started checking the locks herself before bedtime. It began with a letter slipped under their door. No stamp, just block letters on white paper. Drop the case or else. Rachel's hands shook as she read it. She hid the note from Sophie, but Shadow seemed to sense something was wrong. He began sleeping by the front door, body tense, ears twitching at every creak of the old apartment. The next morning, another message, this time spray-painted on the stairwell wall, "You can't hide." Rachel reported the threats to Detective Jacobs, who immediately increased patrols around their building and placed a plainclothes officer at the entrance. For Sophie, the threats hovered like a shadow she couldn't quite name. She started drawing more monsters, sharp teeth, long arms, black eyes, on every scrap of paper she could find. Her sleep grew restless. Shadow rarely left her side, as if he too could feel the gathering storm. On Sunday night, with rain lashing at the windows, the danger became real. Rachel was cleaning up after dinner, glancing at the news, when she heard Shadow growl, a deep, rumbling warning that reverberated through the small apartment. Sophie froze, clutching her book to her chest. The lights flickered, and a muffled sound came from the hallway. The unmistakable scrape of a lock being tampered with. Rachel's heart slammed in her chest. "Sophie, closet, now!" she hissed, pulling her daughter and Shadow into the hall closet and closing the door as quietly as she could. She dialed 911 with shaking hands. Sophie huddled in the darkness, Shadow pressed tightly against her, his body trembling with anticipation but silent, disciplined. Through the slats, Rachel saw the shadow of two figures moving in the entryway, one tall and thin, the other bulky and lumbering. Glass shattered in the kitchen. A man's voice cursed quietly. The air was thick with the smell of fear and rain, and Rachel's mind raced. Should she risk a shout for help? Would the police arrive in time? She stroked Sophie's back, whispering, "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Just hold on. Shadow's here." In the darkness, Sophie didn't answer, but she reached for Shadow's ear and clung tight. Suddenly, one of the men rattled the closet door. Shadow braced, muscles tensing. Rachel braced herself, determined to fight for her daughter if she had to. But before the men could force the door, red and blue lights flashed outside, and sirens wailed up the street. The two intruders bolted, slamming the apartment door behind them. The closet door flew open a minute later as Officer Grace Holloway burst in, followed by Detective Jacobs and two uniformed cops. Grace scooped up Sophie, cradling her as if she were her own daughter, while Shadow nuzzled his way out and stood guard, still on high alert. Rachel collapsed on the hallway floor, tears running down her face as the adrenaline drained away. "We're safe. We're safe," she kept repeating, more to herself than anyone else. Jacobs knelt beside her. "We'll move you both tonight," he said quietly. "You're not going back in there until this is over." That night, Rachel, Sophie, and Shadow were escorted to a safe house on the other side of the city, a modest bungalow watched day and night by trusted officers. The city's social services provided clothes, food, and a few toys for Sophie. Rachel tried to act brave, but the shock of the attack lingered. She checked every lock twice, flinched at the sound of passing cars, and slept with her cell phone clutched in her hand. Yet in the midst of this fear, something remarkable began to happen. Sophie, who had withdrawn further after the attack, started to communicate more. At first, it was through her drawings. She made a picture of a dark, scary monster running away from a brave dog and a little girl. She slid the drawing across the table to Rachel, who smiled through tears and whispered, "That's you, honey. You're the brave one." Grace visited often, sometimes bringing Shadow's favorite treats, sometimes just sitting quietly with Rachel while Sophie played. One afternoon, Sophie handed Grace a note. "Thank you for saving us." It was written in careful block letters, the first words Sophie had given to anyone except her mother in months. Grace blinked away tears, folding the note carefully and promising to keep it forever. As the days passed, Sophie's nightmares gradually lessened. Shadow seemed to know when she was about to wake, pressing his body close so she'd feel his warmth before her mind could spiral back to the terror of that night. Rachel started keeping a journal of Sophie's progress, recording every small step forward, a smile, a whispered word to Shadow, a hand-drawn map of their new safe house. Detective Jacobs, now a daily presence in their lives, taught Sophie how to use a police radio for emergencies. He joked gently with her, showing her his badge and letting her wear his hat. Slowly, Sophie began to respond, first with tiny smiles, then shy giggles. She drew a comic strip of Detective Dog and Super Sophie catching bad guys together, which Jacobs pinned proudly on his bulletin board. Through it all, the pressure of the trial never truly left. Andrea Fields called often, checking on their safety and updating Rachel on the legal battle. "We've got the evidence," she promised. "And now the jury has seen what kind of people we're up against. They're not just criminals, they're cowards." Despite the growing mountain of stress, the support network, Rachel, Grace, Jacobs, and the officers watching over them, grew closer, forming a protective family around Sophie and Shadow. The bonds of trust that had once felt impossible began to strengthen. Rachel even started speaking at small police gatherings about the importance of trauma-informed care, finding her own voice alongside her daughter's journey. Meanwhile, news of the attack leaked to the press, intensifying the city's focus on the trial. But for the first time, Rachel saw not just fear in Sophie's eyes, but a spark of resolve. Sophie began to prepare herself to return to court, practicing yes and no nods, drawing the faces of the people she trusted, and rehearsing simple words with Shadow curled beside her. She was still frightened, but every day she stood a little taller. And as the next day in court approached, Sophie slipped a piece of paper under Rachel's pillow. It was a drawing, herself, holding Shadow's leash, facing a shadowy figure with a big red X through it. At the bottom, in Sophie's careful handwriting, were the words, "Not alone anymore." The morning of Sophie's closed courtroom session dawned with a haze of early summer sun filtering through the curtains of the safe house. Rachel awoke before her alarm, her heart already racing, 1,000 what-ifs tumbling through her mind. Would Sophie freeze? Would the trauma swallow her again? But when she checked Sophie's room, she found her daughter wide awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, Shadow's massive head in her lap. The dog's steady breathing seemed to set the rhythm for Sophie's small, determined hands as she traced her fingers along his ears. Rachel knelt beside them, brushing a stray curl from Sophie's cheek. "Are you ready, honey?" Sophie nodded, solemn but calm, as if she'd already rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. She didn't speak, but her eyes glimmered with something Rachel hadn't seen in a long time: resolve. The courthouse was different this morning. Instead of the packed public gallery and swarming reporters, only the people Sophie trusted most were present. Rachel, Grace, Shadow, Detective Jacobs, Andrea Fields, and Judge Monroe. The blinds were drawn, the lighting soft, every effort made to ensure Sophie felt as safe as possible. Even Marcus Reed was kept at a distance, flanked by deputies, his earlier bravado replaced by a thin-lipped scowl. The jury was absent, This session was about finding the truth, not about putting a spectacle on display. Judge Monroe's face softened as Sophie entered. "Good morning, Sophie," she said, her voice low and gentle. "Remember, you're safe here. You can answer however you feel comfortable. You can point, nod, shake your head, or whisper. And if you need a break, just let us know." Sophie, wearing her blue-flowered dress and gripping Shadow's leash, slid onto the cushioned chair beside Rachel. Grace knelt nearby, one steady hand on Shadow's back. The dog's presence filled the room with a strange calm, like a shield between Sophie and the worst of her memories. Andrea Fields began slowly, her tone careful and deliberate. "Sophie, can you tell us? Do you remember the night at the store?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting from the attorney to Shadow, who looked up at her with unwavering trust. Sophie reached out, fingers twisting in the fur on Shadow's neck. For a long moment, there was only silence. Rachel held her breath, heart thumping wildly. Then, so soft it was almost inaudible, Sophie whispered, "Yes." The room seemed to tilt. Grace blinked back tears, Andrea smiled gently, and even Judge Monroe sat up a little straighter. "Did you see someone there you recognize?" Andrea continued. Sophie didn't speak right away. Instead, she pointed, her small hand trembling, directly at Marcus Reed, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Shadow pressed closer to her leg, tail brushing softly against her shoes. "He was there," Sophie whispered, the words fragile but unmistakably clear. The moment hung in the air, electric and profound. For Sophie, each word was a battle against the memories that had held her prisoner for months. She gripped Shadow's leash tighter, drawing courage from his warmth. Rachel squeezed her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. Detective Jacobs, watching from the side, felt a knot loosen in his chest, a sense that justice, at last, was within reach. Andrea gently continued, "Sophie, was there anything special you remember about what the man did that night?" Sophie's brow furrowed in concentration. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, everyone in the room could see the pain flicker across her face. But then she opened them, determination sparking in their depths. "He took the red scarf," Sophie whispered. "He was angry, loud. He hurt Mr. Nguyen." Shadow's head nudged Sophie's knee, his breath steady. Judge Monroe glanced at the others, Grace, Rachel, and Jacobs, who all nodded encouragement. The judge spoke softly. "Thank you, Sophie. You're doing so well. Is there anything you want to say?" Sophie hesitated, glancing down at Shadow, then at her mother. Then, almost too quiet for anyone but Shadow to hear, she said, "I was scared, but I wasn't alone." That sentence carried a force no adult could muster. It was as if the dam had finally cracked. Rachel wrapped Sophie in her arms, sobbing openly. Grace reached across and rested her hand on Sophie's shoulder, her voice thick. "You're so brave, Sophie. We're all so proud of you." Detective Jacobs leaned in, clearing his throat. "You helped everyone today, kiddo. Shadow's got your back, and so do we." Andrea gently closed her folder. "No more questions, Your Honor." Judge Monroe took a long, steadying breath before speaking. "Let the record show. The witness, Sophie Collins, has answered questions to the best of her ability. Her testimony is clear, consistent, and supported by new forensic evidence." She paused, then addressed Sophie directly. "Thank you for your courage, Sophie. You've helped more people than you know." As the session ended, the adults gave Sophie and Shadow space. Rachel led Sophie outside into the soft sunlight. There, for the first time in months, Sophie let herself laugh, a small, unsure sound that grew as Shadow danced around her, tail wagging wildly. The weight of the world seemed, for a moment, just a little lighter. The news of Sophie's breakthrough session spread quickly through the courthouse. Word reached the jury, the press, and the public. The silent girl found her voice. For Detective Jacobs, it was more than just a case. It was hope in human form. He began volunteering at the local animal shelter, inspired by the healing he'd witnessed between Sophie and Shadow. Andrea, in her office, drafted new protocols for therapy animals in future courtrooms. Grace began to train more retired K-9s for work with children in crisis, using Shadow's example as a blueprint. Back at the safe house that night, Rachel tucked Sophie into bed, Shadow curling up protectively beside her. "I'm so proud of you," Rachel whispered. Sophie turned, looking into her mother's eyes for the first time in weeks, and whispered, "I'm not scared when you're here, or when Shadow's here. I think maybe I can help other kids someday." Rachel smiled, smoothing Sophie's hair. "You already are, sweetheart." As the stars blinked above the city, Sophie drifted to sleep, her hand resting on Shadow's back. The hardest part was over. She'd found her voice, and with it, the power to change everything. When the court session resumed, the city seemed to be holding its breath. The news of Sophie's breakthrough testimony, delivered with Shadow at her side, had already traveled beyond the courthouse walls. Reporters gathered on the steps, their voices hushed and reverent for once, as if sensing they were witnessing the end of something much bigger than just another criminal trial. Inside, Judge Monroe presided with new gravity. The jury, now returned to the box, looked different, less skeptical, more compassionate, the weight of Sophie's words and the mountain of new evidence shaping every glance and gesture. On the prosecution's table, Andrea Fields had laid out the red scarf, the fingerprint reports, and a photograph of Shadow sitting beside Sophie. These were not just pieces of evidence now. They were symbols of hope, of courage, of the unlikely partnership that had turned the tide. Marcus Reed, whose steely confidence had eroded day by day, now sat silent, his lawyer's whispered advice going mostly unanswered. He stared at his hands, no longer trying to catch Sophie's eye. For the first time, he looked small and tired, as if the full weight of his actions was finally bearing down. The closing arguments unfolded with a sense of finality. Andrea spoke first, her words direct and ringing with conviction. Justice is not just about facts and laws. It is about people. It's about a little girl who found the courage to speak, about a dog who never gave up on her, and about a community that chose to stand by the vulnerable instead of the powerful. Marcus Reed thought he could silence the truth with violence and intimidation. But he underestimated Sophie. He underestimated Shadow. And he underestimated all of you. Walton, the defense attorney, tried to cast doubt, but it was clear the jury was no longer listening. The evidence, the fingerprint, the witness testimony, the timeline was airtight. The human story was even more compelling. When Andrea sat down, the courtroom erupted into a heavy, hopeful silence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, Rachel gripped Sophie's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sophie didn't tremble this time. Shadow lay at her feet, his eyes steady, as if he already knew the outcome. On the charge of aggravated assault and attempted murder, the foreperson read, voice trembling, we find the defendant, Marcus Reed, guilty. A collective sigh swept through the room. Reed slumped in his chair. Rachel sobbed openly, clutching Sophie, who leaned down and buried her face in Shadow's fur. Grace squeezed Jacob's arm. Judge Monroe nodded gravely. Let it be entered into the record that justice has been served. It didn't take long for news to spread. The courthouse steps became a scene of joyful chaos, reporters calling out questions, neighbors cheering, even police officers grinning with relief. Cameras flashed as Rachel, holding Sophie in her arms, stepped out into the sunlight. For the first time in months, Sophie looked around at the crowd and, without prompting, waved shyly. Shadow, sensing the shift, gave his best hero dog stance, tail high and proud. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with the story of the girl and the dog who found justice together. News crews requested interviews. Journalists called it a miracle in the courtroom. Parents from across the city wrote to Rachel, sharing stories of their own children struggling with trauma. One letter from a family hundreds of miles away read, "Your daughter gave us hope when we had none left. Thank you." Andrea Fields used the case to champion new legislation, advocating for therapy animals in courtrooms nationwide. Sophie's Law, as it was soon dubbed, promised to give other children the same chance for support and healing that Sophie had found. Officer Grace Holloway, inspired by Shadow's impact, expanded her K-9 therapy program, recruiting and retraining more retired police dogs to serve as companions for children and trauma survivors. Detective Jacobs, whose heart had been hardened by years on the force, found himself changed. He began volunteering at the local animal shelter, organizing Read to a Dog sessions for at-risk kids, teaching them about resilience and kindness. He found a new purpose in helping others find the hope he'd seen blossom between Sophie and Shadow. Rachel and Sophie, too, embraced new beginnings. With the court case behind them, they moved out of their old apartment, leaving behind the memories of fear and darkness. Their new home was smaller, but filled with laughter, sunshine, and dog hair. Sophie, once so silent, began to talk more each day, first to Shadow, then to her mom, and finally to her new classmates at school. Shadow, now a local celebrity, became a fixture at the therapy center, lying quietly beside children who were too afraid to speak or too sad to hope. Sophie joined him during Read to Shadow sessions, her clear, gentle voice encouraging other children to share their stories, however they could. She became a leader, her courage a beacon for others. At a special ceremony held in the courthouse rotunda, Judge Monroe presented Sophie and Shadow with medals of honor. The mayor spoke about bravery, community, and the ripple effects of small acts of kindness. Cameras captured Sophie, standing tall beside her mother, with Shadow sitting faithfully at her feet as she accepted her medal. The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing down the marble halls, a sound Sophie would never forget. Afterward, Rachel knelt beside her daughter. "You know, I'm not just proud of you for what you did in court," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of how you never gave up. You showed the whole world what hope really looks like." Sophie smiled, leaning against her mother's side. "I wasn't alone," she said simply. "Shadow was always there." That night, as they walked home through the warm twilight, Rachel glanced down at her daughter and saw not the frightened, silent girl of months before, but a bright, resilient child who had found her voice. Sophie stopped to let Shadow sniff the grass, then reached down and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Shadow licked her cheek, and together they walked on. As summer melted into autumn, Sophie and Rachel made it a tradition to visit Mr. Nguyen, the store owner who had survived and was recovering slowly. They brought cookies, fresh flowers, and drawings Sophie made for him. Mr. Nguyen would say, "You saved me, little one." Sophie always shook her head and pointed to Shadow, sharing the spotlight with her loyal friend. Word of Sophie and Shadow's story continued to ripple out, touching people they would never meet. The therapy center's waiting list grew longer, and donations poured in. Families who had once felt invisible found hope in the image of a girl and her dog, standing up for the truth. And as the first leaves began to fall, Rachel found herself looking forward to the future, not with fear, but with excitement. She signed up to volunteer with Grace, helping children and parents navigate their own journeys through darkness toward healing. Sophie started writing stories of her own, tales of brave kids and loyal dogs, and read them aloud to anyone who would listen. Justice had been served. But more importantly, new beginnings had bloomed from the courage of a girl, the devotion of a dog, and the love of a community that learned, through them, to choose hope over fear. In the weeks after the trial, the world seemed to slow down for Sophie and Rachel. No more courtrooms, no more urgent phone calls, no more waiting for the next crisis to come crashing through their lives. Instead, their days filled up with simple routines: school, therapy, walks in the park with Shadow, visits with friends and neighbors who had cheered them on from afar. Yet, even as normalcy crept back in, it was clear that something fundamental had changed in Sophie, in her mother, and in everyone who'd witnessed their story. It started locally, in their own neighborhood. Mrs. Price, the elderly neighbor from downstairs, who had once seemed distant and irritable, now greeted Sophie with cookies and warm smiles every week. "You know, dear, we all watched out for you," she confided one afternoon, her voice quivering. "But it was you and that wonderful dog who showed us how to be brave." Sophie listened quietly, her eyes wide, and handed Shadow a treat from her pocket, as if to thank him for bringing people closer. At the community center, Grace Holloway and Detective Jacobs sat down with Rachel one evening to talk about everything that had happened. It was less an interview than a gathering of friends, each person changed by the case, each one searching for meaning in the aftermath. Grace started, her hands folded in her lap, her voice soft but sure. "I think about the night we almost lost you all," she said, nodding at Rachel and Sophie. "And I think about how easy it would have been for any of us to give up. But you didn't, Rachel. You fought for Sophie every step of the way. That's the only reason any of this was possible." Rachel shook her head, smiling through tears. "I didn't always feel brave," she admitted. "Most days I was terrified. But Sophie was my reason. Every parent out there would do the same. And honestly, Grace, you and Shadow were our miracles." Detective Jacobs, usually so stoic, cleared his throat. "I learned something on this case I never learned in all my years as a cop. Healing isn't a straight line. I watched Sophie fight every day for a little bit of progress. A nod, a smile, a picture. Some days were 2 steps back. But every time she tried, she taught us something about what real courage is. Not the movie kind, but the quiet, hard kind." Grace nodded, looking at Sophie with pride. "Shadow was broken too after he retired. I used to worry he'd never be the same, that all those scars would make him unable to trust again. But when he met Sophie, it was like they recognized each other's pain. They taught each other how to heal. And in the process, they healed a lot of us too." That night, Rachel wrote in her journal, a new tradition she'd started to help make sense of everything. Healing is never linear. For Sophie, it came in whispers, in pictures, in days when getting out of bed felt impossible. For me, it was learning to be patient with myself, to ask for help, and to keep believing even when things seemed hopeless. Recovery wasn't a staircase. It was a winding path, sometimes circling back, sometimes stumbling, but always moving, however slowly, toward something brighter. As the days passed, the lessons of Sophie's journey rippled outward. At school, Sophie became something of a legend among her classmates. Children who had once ignored her or whispered about her silence now came to her for advice, or just to sit quietly with Shadow during lunch. The teachers noticed other students, some shy, some struggling, start to open up as well. One afternoon, a boy named Mason, who had barely spoken since losing his father, sat next to Sophie on the playground and simply rested his hand on Shadow's back. No words passed between them, but something softened in Mason's expression. Healing, the teachers realized, could be contagious. Rachel volunteered to share her family's story at parent nights and community meetings. She spoke honestly about the pain, the setbacks, and the moments of doubt. But she also spoke about the power of small acts of belief. The judge who allowed Shadow in the courtroom, the officer who sat outside their door all night, the social worker who brought coloring books and kind words when everything felt lost. Sometimes, Rachel told the room, it's the tiniest act of faith that keeps you moving forward. Even Judge Monroe reached out, sending Sophie a handwritten letter. You reminded us all, the judge wrote, that justice isn't only about winning a case. It's about giving a voice to the voiceless, about understanding trauma, and about honoring the slow, brave journey back to wholeness. As for Grace and Jacobs, their work took on new meaning. Grace's Therapy K9 program expanded, welcoming more dogs and children. Jacobs started a volunteer program at the animal shelter, pairing traumatized kids with gentle, retired police dogs, an initiative that, over the months, brought dozens of children out of silence and back into the world. And what about Sophie? As the weeks turned to months, her voice grew steadier, her laughter more frequent. She still had nightmares sometimes, but she learned that talking about them made them smaller. With Shadow at her side, she led Read to Shadow sessions for other kids, teaching them, without realizing it, that you didn't have to be loud or fearless to be brave. Courage, she showed, could be a soft word, a gentle hand, or simply the willingness to trust one more time. Reflecting on it all, Rachel began to see that Sophie's story was not just about a courtroom or a crime. It was about community, about the ripple effect of compassion and patience. It was about how, when one person chooses hope, when one judge makes a hard call, one officer offers a steady hand, one dog stays close to a frightened child, that hope spreads. Each small act of belief grows, touching lives in ways none of them could have predicted. At a city gathering months after the verdict, Sophie was invited on stage, Shadow beside her. She didn't say much, but she did say this. Sometimes, being quiet is just another way to be brave. And sometimes, all you need is one friend, on 2 legs or 4, to help you find your voice again. The audience applauded, but it was the children in the front row, the ones with nervous eyes and hesitant smiles, who understood her best. What did the journey teach us? Asterisk healing is never linear. Progress is messy and full of setbacks. But every effort, every tiny act of hope, matters. Asterisk courage takes many forms. It can be a bark, a whispered word, a silent act of kindness, or the decision to try again after failure. Asterisk animals and people can heal each other. Shadow was as wounded as Sophie, and together they found purpose, strength, and joy. Asterisk support systems matter. Family, friends, strangers. No one heals alone. The love and faith of a community can change everything. Asterisk justice is about more than the law. It's about seeing the whole person, honoring their pain, and helping them reclaim their story. Asterisk. Every act of belief ripples outward. A judge's courage, a mother's faith, a dog's loyalty. Each shapes the future in ways unseen. As autumn leaves drifted past the window and the world moved on, Sophie and her circle, Rachel, Grace, Jacobs, and all those touched by their journey, carried these lessons forward. They became advocates, mentors, friends. Their story continued, not as a headline, but as a beacon for anyone fighting through the silence, searching for hope, and waiting for their own voice to be heard. Years later, on a bright spring morning, the city buzzed with a rare energy. Banners fluttered on the lampposts along Main Street. Opening day, the Shadow Center for Child Courage. A crowd gathered outside a new brick building, its windows shining in the sunlight, a symbol of hope built from heartbreak and healing. Inside, everything pulsed with anticipation. Children, some nervous, some laughing, held their parents' hands or clung to the soft ears of therapy dogs lounging in the welcome hall. Teachers, counselors, and police officers mingled, shaking hands, sharing stories. On one wall, a mural depicted a little girl with brown hair and a battered German shepherd standing proudly at her side, sunlight streaming down on them both. Underneath were words painted in careful script. Courage is sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but always brave. Near the front, Sophie Collins stood tall, her hair now long and her eyes bright with confidence. She wore a simple blue dress, reminiscent of the one she'd worn in court all those years ago. Beside her, grayer around the muzzle but just as proud, was Shadow. Older now, slower, but still alert to every emotion in the room. When a nervous child brushed past, Shadow nudged them gently with his nose, tail wagging softly. Even as the years had crept by, the bond between Sophie and Shadow remained unbroken. Rachel watched her daughter from the back of the hall, heart swelling with pride and awe. She remembered the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the moments when it seemed hope was lost. Now, watching Sophie speak to the gathered crowd, Rachel felt that every setback had led them to this place of joy and possibility. Judge Monroe, a special guest of honor, took the stage. Her hair was streaked with silver now, her voice deeper but still commanding. Today, we honor not just a building, but a movement, she began. We honor the bravery of every child who refuses to give up, the strength of every family who stands by them, and the power of a community that believes healing is possible for all. She turned, inviting Sophie to speak. The room fell silent as Sophie approached the podium, Shadow at her side. She paused, steadying herself, then looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many new. When I was little, I was afraid all the time, Sophie began. I thought being silent meant I was weak, but I learned that silence is just another kind of wound. It doesn't make you less strong. Sometimes it means you're holding all your courage inside, waiting for the right moment to share it. She looked down at Shadow, reaching to scratch behind his ears. This dog saved me, more than once. He didn't care that I couldn't talk. He just stayed with me. Because of Shadow, I found my voice. Because of my mom, my friends, and all the people who believed in us, I learned that even the smallest act of hope can change a life. As she spoke, her words rang out with a clarity and power that brought tears to more than one eye. That's what this center is for, Sophie continued. It's for kids who are scared, who think they're alone, who don't know if anyone will ever understand. It's for parents and teachers and police officers who want to help, but don't always know how. And it's for all the shadows out there, dogs and people who show up, even when it's hard, and refuse to give up on us. Applause thundered through the hall. Sophie smiled shyly and waved, Shadow wagging his tail as if he understood he was part of the celebration too. Rachel hugged Grace Holloway, who had spent years building the Therapy K-9 program that was now a core part of the Shadow Center's work. Detective Jacobs, in civilian clothes, snapped a picture to send to the original Read to Shadow group, most of them now college students or young professionals, forever linked by the journey they'd shared. As the festivities continued, Sophie led tours of the center. She showed visitors the reading nook, lined with books, beanbags, and always a dog or two ready to listen. She introduced children to new therapy teams, telling each one, "It's okay to be scared. You don't have to talk until you're ready. The dogs don't mind." In the art room, walls were covered with colorful drawings, rainbows, brave children, dogs with shining eyes. Sophie pointed to one. "That's how I started too, drawing before I could talk. Sometimes pictures are the first step." Outside on the new playground, Sophie watched as a boy hesitated on the edge, his shoulders hunched. She walked over, crouched beside him, and placed Shadow's leash gently in his hands. "You can walk with him," she said. "He's really good at listening." The boy nodded, wiping his eyes, and took his first tentative steps around the playground, Shadow matching his pace, patient and calm. Later, at the closing ceremony, Sophie was asked what she would tell any child who felt voiceless, scared, or alone. She paused, considering, then said, "I was scared, but Shadow believed in me. When you feel alone, don't give up. Someone will stand by you. Sometimes, healing is slow. Sometimes, hope walks in on 4 paws. And sometimes, your voice will change the world." The room was silent for a long moment, the truth of Sophie's words echoing in every heart. Judge Monroe stepped forward, embracing Sophie and presenting her with a plaque. "For extraordinary courage, unbreakable hope, and a legacy that will inspire generations." After the ceremony, Rachel and Sophie sat quietly together on a bench outside the center, watching families file out, children laughing and dogs barking with joy. Rachel slipped her arm around Sophie. "You've changed so many lives," she whispered. Sophie leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "You did too, Mom. You never gave up on me." As the sun set behind the new center, golden light bathing the street in warmth, the lessons of Sophie and Shadow's journey felt more relevant than ever. Silence is a wound, not a weakness, and it can heal. Sophie had learned this firsthand, and now shared it with every frightened child who walked through the Shadow Center's doors. True support is patient, creative, and steadfast. Healing took a whole community, a mother's persistence, a judge's openness, the wisdom of teachers and officers, the loyalty of a therapy dog. Animals can be bridges where words cannot go. Time and again, Shadow and the dogs who followed him showed that love, presence, and patience could reach places people sometimes could not. It takes a community to heal trauma, and every community can choose hope, one act at a time. From a neighbor's kind word to a city's new law, the ripple effect was real. The smallest voice, backed by love, can bring justice and joy to a broken world. Sophie had once been the quietest child in the room, but her courage had inspired thousands to speak up, reach out, and believe. As night fell, Sophie and Rachel walked home, Shadow padding beside them. The lights of the Shadow Center glowed behind them, a beacon in the darkness, a promise that every act of courage, every step toward healing, would echo on for generations. And so the legacy continued, not just in brick and mortar, but in the hearts of every child who discovered that even the quietest voice can roar with hope.